My name is John Pfeffer, and I am the Director of Global Just Transition at the Institute for Policy Studies, a think tank in Washington, D.C. And I've been doing some videos as well for Project Save the World, a wonderful outfit from Canada. And we'll be doing a series of discussions on the question of climate justice, including this very fascinating question of climate reparations and climate debt. And today joining me, and I'm very fortunate to be able to welcome Meena Raman, and she is a long-time climate activist based in Malaysia and a really very perceptive analyst of climate justice questions and climate justice issues. She's the Deputy Executive Director of the Third World Network, itself a wonderful network, and also the head of Friends of the Earth Malaysia. And I should also mention she's the head of the climate justice program at Third World Network. So welcome, Meena. I'm really delighted that you can join us.
Happy to join this program.
So first, I thought we'd just start with a definition. How would you define climate reparations?
Well, this has been one of the most debated questions, I must say. And I think maybe I would actually start with the Framework Convention on Climate Change before we even go to general definitions that a lot of scholars and civil society and climate justice activists also, when they have been speaking or writing about. If you look at the Framework Convention itself, which is the Climate Change, United Nations Climate Change, Framework on Climate Change, which came out of the Rio Summit in 1992, which was really a historical summit where the world got together to analyze the environmental problems of that time. And I think many of I'm not sure who your listeners are, but by and large, currently, a lot of young activists do not know or were not even born during those days. Myself and perhaps you, John, we were part of that moment when it was really quite a landmark summit. The developed world was actually trying to blame the developing countries to say that the reason why the environment and even the climate crisis was happening was largely due to the large numbers of population. It was due to the large numbers of Indians and Chinese that were being born, including in Africa and so on. And I think for a lot of global South organizations, including my own organization, which was involved, what we began to flip the narrative was to show that this is not about the consumption or the population problem of the developing world, although population is important, but it's not the only metric by which one looks at how the environmental crisis and the planetary crisis has erupted, including greenhouse gas emissions. And what we had shown was that you have to look at who is consuming much of the world's resources. And then at that time in 1992, it was very clear from the literature that was coming out from the discussions that 20% of the rich world were consuming 80% of the world's resources. So if you look at the American consumer consuming, the amount of food that an American consumer was consuming was many, many times much more than an African consumer or a Chinese consumer or an Indian consumer, a person in terms of consumption. So then people began the spotlight was basically about inequality. And I think the climate justice and the reparations context has to be taken in context of the world inequality. Now, most recently, just a few days ago, there was a new report World Inequality Report, which was just released, which showed that 0.01% of the rich world, which is largely in the Western world, is consuming or has a wealth of three-quarters of the rest of the world. So you can see the disproportionate control of the wealth of the world in the hands of a small group of people who are largely responsible for destroying the planet and for causing the climate crisis. So, coming back to the climate justice lens and the Framework Convention on Climate Change, what was born out of the Rio conference was this principle of equity, which is really fundamental. And the reason why I stress the Framework Convention, this is a legal treaty. It's not just any paper that you or I have written. It's actually a negotiated legal treaty that when countries got together, including the United States, negotiated it. And it was acknowledged that you have to recognize the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, that there is a common problem, but there is a differentiated responsibility, and it's called the equity principle. This is so fundamental, and it came out of the recognition, including in the convention itself, which clearly shows that the historical emissions of the developed world was really largely responsible for the climate impacts. And this was in this legal treaty in 1992. And lately, this has also been acknowledged by the ICJ, the International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion, which has come out due to climate justice movements, particularly in the small island states, with Vanuatu leading, which has led this outcome. It's an advisory opinion which actually recognizes and acknowledges this principle of equity in common but differentiated responsibility. And we also know that much of the greenhouse gases, of carbon dioxide being the gas that is fundamentally also responsible as a greenhouse gas for global warming and the impacts that we see, is largely in the atmosphere for thousands and thousands of years. So it's not that it disappears. It's there in the environment. And the impacts that we see today in the global south, not only the global south, even we see that in the US or we see it in Europe and so on. And I just want to acknowledge that even there's a most recent report that has just come out. I'm not sure whether you've seen it, John, which actually shows that if you look at historical responsibility, and they looked at it from 1950, but the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change actually takes historical responsibility from 1850 onwards. And if you look at the historical emissions, and they have looked at and we in civil society and in the Third World Network, we look at what's called a fair shares perspective, that everyone is actually entitled to the atmospheric space. That's a principle number one. And that given this that entitlement, there is a, if you want to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial levels, which is what the Paris Agreement says. It says you have to limit to two degrees from pre-industrial level, 2 degrees centigrade from pre-industrial levels, and you have to pursue towards 1.5 limit. Of course, a lot of us subscribe to the 1.5 degree centigrade limit, but unfortunately today we are already in the 1.4 degrees, 1.48 degree temperature rise already. So we are really close to breaching the 1.5 degree centigrade limit, and even whether we will limit temperature rise within 2 degrees is highly questionable. But having said that, this new report actually also says that much of the historical emissions are due to the global north, particularly the United States and Europe and even Japan and so on. And then they say that the lot of the impacts that are being witnessed today are being borne by the global south. And they even say that much of the damage that comes out of loss and because of the losses and damage due to climate impacts, and they have costed it. And they say that much of it is actually the largest, actually, is being borne by India and China. Now, this is quite interesting because many people in the and in the climate debates they say that India and China are largely responsible for a lot of the emissions. It's true if you take that in from a population lens, because these two countries, India being one of the world's largest population, followed by China, and if you take that into account, then of course the absolute emissions are large. But you can't fault these countries for having large populations because they happen to be large countries. But if you take a per capita, that means if you take a per capita approach, and this is where within the climate justice and the reparations lens and the historical responsibility lens, we do have to look at it from a per capita approach. So you see that the amount of historical responsibility from 1850 on the developed world is very large. So because they have what many scholars, including you have UK scholars from Jason Hickel and Andrew Fanning, a lot of not only them, but even the Third World Network with Martin Core, the late Martin Core, and many of us from the Global South who have looked at this whole fair shares perspective and have attributed a lot of the responsibility rightly to the developed world. And you must also remember that much of the Global South was under colonial rule. So the colonial history is also important. So in the way in which the British Empire or the Spaniards or the Portuguese, in the way the colonial economy was run, and then post-colonialism, much of the consumption emissions also, much of the issue of China. China has become a factory for the rest of the world, where much of the industries from the West, which go to China, a lot of the emissions which are being emitted are also due to the consumption emissions of the global North. So, this is why this is not such a simple issue, and one must place it in context in terms of who is actually responsible for a lot of the emissions, even today in terms of the consumption emissions. So, in short, coming to the definition and the context of reparations and historical responsibility, it is largely you have to take a historical perspective. You have to look at how emissions happened. And maybe the other point to recognize also is that the developed world grew rich not because it was smarter or because it was whiter than the rest of the world. The emissions were embedded through a fossil fuel based economy. It ran on fossil fuels, and much of which is now being fossil fuel. The acknowledgement that fossil fuels is a big driver of emissions is acknowledged, except the Donald Trump presidency. But you do need to recognize that the global economy is muchly dependent on fossil fuels. But when you talk about a phase out or phase down and so on, it's very difficult because, particularly in the global south, because it is a transformation that needs to happen with a lot of finance and so on. So when we look at the amount of usage of the carbon budget from a 1.5 degree limit or a 2 degree limit, that carbon budget has been overused by the developed world. And so there is a climate debt which is owing, and that climate debt has to be paid for. And then you have to also pay for the current impacts that are being seen in terms of loss and damage and so on. So this is critical. It's not charity. I mean, the global south is not saying that, please, we need you rich world, you are so rich, you're so clever. Now you need to pay us because, we are beggars. This is not about begging. This is not about charity. This is really about colonialism, post-colonialism, the way in which the economies have been run, and still today, how a lot of the south-north transfer of resources, either to debt repayments or through terms of trade like commodities. A lot of the commodity prices, I mean, the developed world has been the producer of many commodities, largely because of the way in which our economies have been patterned. And then the prices are dictated by New York and Brussels and so on, and Tokyo. And so much of the payments that are unfair, So if you look at the south-north flow of resources, this is not even taken into account in terms of the climate debt which is owed. Is the real south-north flow of transfer, including brain drain. Much of our people are now in the global north. And of course, you have big issues around it, but there has been a brain drain of if you look at the whole Silicon Valley in the US, California, much of the Indians, if the Indian subcontinent didn't export its people, you wouldn't be having an economy down there. So this is the context of what we talk about in terms of climate debt, reparations, and the historical injustice that needs to be rectified.
Thank you. That was excellent. A wonderful overview, very rich, and you know it always strikes me that many people, especially here in the United States and in Europe too, think that colonialism is over. You know that you know states are independent and we are living in a post-colonial world. But as you point out, so much of this legacy of colonialism is still with us, still embedded in relationships between the global north and the global south, and in the very kind of foundational tenets of environmentalism as well. I mean, as you point out in your very first comments, you know, there were some basic racist colonial attitudes embedded in early environmental movement, talking about responsibility, that it was the irresponsibility of people in the global south having children, not taking care of their resources the way they should be, according to those definitions. That was, you know, the early environmentalists here in the United States with respect to Native Americans as well, that they weren't kind of taking care of their resources the right way, and we, the white people, had to step in and, as environmentalists, and take care of things. So the environmental justice movement, the climate justice movement, is, as you point out, a kind of a decolonization struggle that's still taking place today, both within the environmental movement and outside of the environmental movement. And that's such an important kind of consideration that unfortunately is so often ignored here in the global north. And I really appreciate your elevating that. When we talk about the climate debt, and again, really important to emphasize that the global south is not asking for charity, you know, in payments, reparation payments. And that actually holds true across the spectrum for African Americans here in the United States, and asking for charity, and Native American movements in the land back movement not asking for charity. This is, again, part of a kind of decolonization struggle in both cases. But when we're talking about the climate debt, how do we get a handle on, well, the size of it, and not only the kind of the magnitude of the climate. I mean, we have some sense of the magnitude of our problem, of the climate crisis problem, and you, as you pointed out, you know, struggling to get to that, to hold to that 1.5 degrees Celsius increase since pre-industrial times. We have some sense of the magnitude. We have some sense of the catastrophes that are taking place throughout the world, and as you point out, you know, taking place disproportionately in the global south and disproportionately in felt by folks in India and China. So we have some sense of that magnitude, but how do we get a sense of the magnitude of the climate debt that we're talking about here?
Yeah, I think at this point, it's a number that's not that's still um, you know hard to get around to, but there are many studies that point to it. But maybe I will just highlight one particular one, because I talked about Jason Hickel and Andrew Fanning, and the reason why I do that is because sometimes you see, even most listeners, if we have studies coming from the global north, seems far more acceptable than that coming from the global south. Even in the way we look at, because a lot of it is actually the mindset which has been, which, as you rightly say, has to be decolonized. But this important study in 2022 already looking at the fair shares approach and looking at historical emissions and how much is owed to the global south. And the number is actually quite staggering. And the Jason Hickel study also looked at net zero by 2050, and it looked at all the global north and the global south together, and it said that something like 192 trillion is owed to the global south, really in terms of what has been appropriated in terms of the atmospheric space. So that's if you have a pie and the pie has been overused by a small group of countries, then the what is owed to the rest of the world with the global south is in the order of 192 trillion around the world, which roughly, uh, is a huge amount of money. And they even say that this has to, you actually have to disburse something like 500 billion annually to the global south. So this is people will say, wow, this is a huge amount of money, but that's the significance of what we're talking about. It's like when you have overeaten something and somebody else has been deprived, and so you actually need to pay for it. And therefore that's why the numbers are in the trillions. But when you come to the climate finance discussions within even the climate change regime, these numbers in the trillions are not acknowledged. And then maybe, your next question in terms of how, therefore, the world has been responding. But in the kind of trillions that we talk about in terms of the 192 trillion by 2050, that's a moral number, that's a ethical number. But in the legal context of what has been discussed in the United Nations framework last year, in Azerbaijan, there was this discussion about defining a new finance goal. And during that discussion, because the Hillary Clinton and Obama earlier in 2010, in the run up to well before Paris in 2010, they came up with a number that they plucked from the sky. And they said that the global north, the developed world, will mobilize. They didn't talk about a provision. Said will mobilize 100 billion annually by 2020. And then they extended that to 2025 when they signed on to the Paris Agreement. And then there was this new discussion about the new goal, post 100 billion. And that new goal became a very contentious number. And the global south actually demanded 1.3 trillion annually by 2030, actually. And there was a lot of debate around that. And finally, what we landed, because the US was very much a player during that discussion, they said this is not about provision. We refuse to acknowledge the obligation under the Paris Agreement, which actually, if anybody who reads English, and you don't need to be a lawyer to do that, because it says very clearly that the developed world shall provide finance to developing countries for mitigation, which is about emission reductions, and for adaptation. And it says shall. Now, but it's unfortunate that the English-speaking world doesn't understand English, and they come and say, look, and the US in particular and the rest of the global north hid behind the US and supported the United States in that. And we landed with something called a 300 billion mobilizing, which was a tripling of the 100 billion by 2035. So it's a huge, a 10-year time frame, which are mobilizing, which is not a provision. And then they say that you mobilize this from the private sector, you mobilize this from the multilateral development banks. And again, it's a non-recognition of the obligation and refusal to acknowledge historical responsibility. So there we are. From something like 500 billion annually, which is Jason Hickles and others are talking about, you're landing here with a 300 billion by 2035. And so the developed countries haven't moved an inch in terms of what they need to, the obligation. So civil society was actually calling for 5 trillion as a down payment annually in the run up to Baku last year. And so this is really a big issue in terms of the payment of the climate debt and for that. Yeah, so there we are. And this
Yeah.
is the crisis we are in.
Yeah, I mean the sad truth of the matter is that uh, as our analysts, whether they're in the global north or the global south, provide greater detail on the size of the climate debt, the gap between the climate debt as identified, whether it's expressed in annual terms or expressed as an overall figure, the gap between that and what the is being mobilized is getting larger. I mean, that's the
Exactly.
sad truth of the matter. I mean, it's like, the gap between our ability to address climate change and the effects of climate change is getting larger, and the difference between the obligation, the size of the debt, and the actual day-to-day ability of global north governments to mobilize that money, even before the Trump administration was elected. I mean, once the Trump administration is elected, then the United States is no longer actually part of the picture because it's not interested in paying anything, zero. And in fact, one could argue that they're interested in quite the opposite. They obviously want to
Exactly.
extract more from the global south, which would only
Absolutely.
increase the debt. So
Exactly.
this is very sober kind of realization. I mean, how do civil society organizations like your own deal with this unfortunate reality?
See, well, this unfortunate reality, as we know it, requires really mobilization of climate justice movements across the world. Without international solidarity in the global south and in the global north, this is not going to happen. So we recognize that there is the Trump administration and what they have done, and even before that, even the political appetite for acknowledging the payment of the climate debt is something that was not even there. But now it's even gotten even worse than that, particularly because a lot of the money, and this is where the problem comes. They say we have no money, but look at, is it really a case of lack of money? But they do have money. They have money for NATO expansion, for the military industrial complex, money for bombs, money for Gaza, the aiding the Israel genocide in Gaza. There's money for all that, money for all the wrong things.
Yeah.
And in fact, Hugo Chavez many years ago, when he was during the climate talks and the run up to Paris, he actually said if that the climate was a bank, he would have been bailed out by now. So there is money. It's not a question of lack of money. They can always print money. And there are other ways that we have been saying that given the lack of political will and appetite at the moment, one of the things that we have been calling for, and in other developing countries have been doing that, including Brazil and the G20 and so on, in terms of wealth tax on the billionaires. Now, why do you have you got to come back to the inequality question? Billionaires of the world, the 0.001% who are responsible for much of the emissions of the world, they should be taxed. How can they get away scot-free? So when we talk about the tax convention, now, the same countries, and this is where even in Belém in Brazil, when we just had the COP30 there, when we were talking about the provision of climate finance, these same northern developed countries, which did not include the US because the US was not there, they are the same blockers of a global tax convention in the UN, which is being negotiated currently. So if you are not able to take money out of your budgets, why are you stopping the taxation of rich, wealthy individuals? Which makes sense. Now, the other, of course, they have trillions of dollars for fossil fuel subsidies in the global north. If you remove that fossil fuel subsidies, because why are you subsidizing what you say on the one hand, the Europeans and others, they're very ambitious. They talk about a fossil fuel phase out. Actually, they only talk about it rhetorically. In the real world, they are expanding fossil fuel production on the ground. We've seen Oil Change International and the reports that have come out. And worse with the Trump administration, all of us, including my own country, through the Trump deals and tariff fights, they are asking a country like mine to import coal and gas from the US. I mean, here we are, a party to the Paris Agreement. There we are being told that you have to import, otherwise, you face the consequences of high tariffs. This is ridiculous. And so, never mind all that. But the point is, there is money, there is a will. If there is a will, there is a way of how to get that money. So this is, and civil society has been talking about removal of fossil fuel subsidies, taxing the global, I mean, the billionaires of the world, and a whole range of others that measures of raising money. And of course, one of the problems is actually the special drawing rights that we have talked about before in the IMF. The International Monetary Fund has a reserve currency, and it's called special drawing rights, which they can issue. And this was done during the post-COVID pandemic with $650 billion issued overnight, which largely went to the developed world for the economic crisis that the northern global north was facing in particular. And so that could be done, 650 billion overnight through the special drawing rights being issued without affecting anybody's budget. No impact on anybody's budget. But in order to do that, you need the US approval, because the voting rights within the IMF or even the World Bank is determined by the shares of what you hold. So the US still is a problem, because even if the rest of the world agreed that you should issue the special drawing rights, which unfortunately the rest of the developed world hasn't agreed to, so you still would need the US approval. So you can't use that special drawing rights, and that's a problem. So this is where we are. I mean, it's not a question of no money or a lack of money. It's the political will. And this is where I think we in movements, it's not just the civil society, but social movements, both in the global north and the global south, we have to up the ante, and we have to continue to do what we need to do in terms of holding our governments to account. So, we have no other choice. This
Yeah.
is the only thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in everybody's interest. It's this planetary, saving the planet and also saving the poor. And maybe the
Absolutely.
one final thing I do need to say here, this whole anti-immigrant obsession, blaming and scapegoating the immigration problem, that all of us want to come to the global north because, we love the global north. That's not the case. It's a lot of problems. When you have societies and economies destroyed, where do you expect people to go? The boats that they take, the deplorable conditions under they come, the illegal, the lack of documentation, coming and coming to the borders and killing with risks and being killed and being deported. I mean, this is not something which is nice, but why? This is where we need to see that the more that we save the global south and ensure that the resources and financial needs and the resilience of people is built so that people have jobs, people have livelihoods, people have food, and we meet the problems of hunger, there will not be this crisis that's happening from the global south to the global north. And also it's a scapegoating of the global south. If the economies in the global north are failing, it's probably you have to look at the kind of economic policies that have driven the same jobs that are being lost in the global north. And it's because of the billionaires and the corporate capture of the world. The billionaires and the multinational corporations and the transnationals are responsible. The capitalists have exploited all of us. And so don't blame the global south and being and you know governments, of course, who want to be popular. And it's extremely very worrying to see the move to the right wing ascendance, not only in the US, but also in many parts of Europe, and now even in many parts of Latin America.
Yeah.
It's extremely frightening. I'm sorry that I am bringing this to your show, but I do
No,
think
this is
that
necessary.
this is absolutely necessary. So I think, you know, that's why we are all united in this fight to show that there is a systemic failure, and that systemic failure is leading to hunger, poverty, inequality, planetary crisis of systemic proportions, that the transformation that is needed requires the kind of global unity and solidarity and the narrative of progressive politics that needs to reclaim the power and reclaim the narrative, and to show that, you know, the global south and the global north and the poor everywhere, both in the global north and the global south, that unite. And if Zoran Mamdani is winning in New York, it's largely because he's responding to the workers of the global north. The same in the global south. We are no different. We have to, it's the system that is destroying us and continues to destroy us. And this is what the correction that needs to happen goes beyond just the issue about climate justice and climate debt. It's really much larger in terms of looking at a reform of the international order.
Yeah.
And many of us have been talking about the new international order in the way we produce, in the way we consume, in the way governance of institutions are run, and basically to hold governments to account everywhere. The global south governments are not angels either, but that's
No.
our job. That's
Yeah.
our job to hold them accountable.
Yeah. Well, as you point out, there is money. It is a question of political will, but for the most part, leaders don't find political will themselves. They don't find their own backbones. Uh, they have to be persuaded. They have to be pushed to find political will, and that is so often the 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 task of popular movements, to force our leaders to find political will to shift money away from, as you put it, the sectors of the economy that are dying or should be dying, to the sectors of the economy that we want to see prosper. I also think it's really important you point out the critical importance of focusing on consumption, because so often there, especially on these issues around climate change, there's been a focus on the production of, of carbon dioxide by manufacturing, by agriculture, by whatever, but on the production side of things, without focusing on the consumption side. And that there is a demand, unfortunately, for more and more electricity, whether it's, for luxury goods, yachts, private airplanes, or data centers, or, what have you. And the consumption, obviously, per capita is much higher in the global north than in the global south. And so, once again, if you look at the consumption side of the equation, the debt continues to accumulate. But it's the last point you make, which is really interesting, the need to kind of transform, of course, the global economy and global institutions. And I've argued in the past that, with respect to the United States, that climate change has offered a kind of an opportunity, a kind of a lever, if you will, to transform the economy. We saw just a little bit of that under the Biden administration, just a little bit. The return to kind of industrial policy, and a couple of good policies here and there within the administration. Of course, that's been turned around now. But in general, I still think it is true that the threat of climate change allows us to rethink our economy, because our economy, the capitalist economy, obviously got us into this problem. So in order to get out of it, we have to rethink the economy, both the production side and the consumption side. But I think your argument is even larger about the necessity of using this crisis for larger scale transformation of the global economy and global institutions. And I'm curious if you've thought more about what that would entail, or if you see some examples of that kind of taking place in different parts of the world.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that there is a lot of opportunity here to rethink, because it's really obvious that this global economy and the model of development that many of us in our part of the world just accepted lock, stock, and barrel from the global north, and are going on the same bandwagon. And now the realization that you're coming to a time when you cannot do this anymore. So it's not just about the greenhouse gases and the climate impacts. It's really also about the planetary limits. I mean, one of the things that my organization and even the local organized national groups like the Consumers Association of Penang, you talk about consumerism. This is one of the biggest things that we fought many years ago. And in fact, the Consumers Association of Penang, which is more than 50 years old now, took a lot of inspiration from Public Citizen and the Ralph Nader movement and so on, where you look at even the simple thing like unsafe at any speed, where you build cars which are intended to kill. So it's all about the production of cars without, because it will benefit the car manufacturers. And they were actually willing to kill people because they costed the fact that that even if people died, it didn't matter. So from the toxics, from the chemicals, from the cancers that we're seeing, it's 1 in 2 people in the US now who have cancers. And now my part of the world is 1 in 4. So we all understand this. It's not just the planetary crisis, but it's also the health and our bodies and the systems that have been damaged. Maybe another example to give, which is illustrative of how we fought from the consumer standpoint in terms of how multinational corporations were only interested in their own profit. Is we call the tobacco companies the merchants of death. Now, they knew cigarette smoking was going to kill people, but did they care? No, they didn't. Same with the infant food formula, the Nestle's and so on of the world, who were carte blanche coming to our part of the world, going to the hospitals and telling mothers that house milk is much better for women and children than if baby I mean mother's milk. I mean, this whole consumerist culture, the advertising. I mean, we talk about materialism and how the this is why the production system and the consumption pattern needs to be really interrogated, which we have been doing over the years, to say in whose interests are these corporations functioning. It's not in our interest. So in this issue about the industrial economy, looking at it, and now if you look at China and you look at the scale of renewable energy, and the amount of, if today solar and wind and all is much cheaper, it's largely because of the efforts of the Chinese. And that is acknowledged around the world. So thanks to the Chinese that we are able to have at least a scaling up of renewable energy. But also important to recognize is that the reason why they have been successful is because of state-owned enterprises. The state as a responsibility, which is what the Biden administration was doing in terms of the state playing a role in driving the way in which the economy should go. But take a step back, and this is what the World Trade Organization tried to dismantle in terms of what they said the policy space of countries needs to be regulated so that you rules of the game were rigged in favor of the foreign corporations and not in the hands of of the national economy, not in the hands of the government. And the free trade agreements, I mean, maybe many people already are aware now, the investor state dispute settlement mechanism under the free trade agreements, which actually say that a company can sue a government for taking environmental and health measures and for billions of dollars. Now, why? So, this was because the corporations were supported by the global North governments in terms of this neoliberal economy to actually dismantle the state so that corporations rule the world. And this is where we have another big movement called the Our World Is Not for Sale, the battle for Seattle, the big fights that we've had, and so on. So, which is something that continues today. And so, in terms of successes, I think civil society has managed to prevent much more damage in terms of the multilateral agreement on investment, which was actually defeated many years ago and led by the late Martin Gore with the Our World Is Not for Sale and so on, which is really important, and the International Forum on Globalization. The people like Jerry Mander and others who Mont Barlow, big names, all in the fighting against so-called free trade, and which is continuing to be important. So these movements coming together in terms of the climate change, and this is the other thing that we are recognizing, that many of our movements cannot be siloed anymore. They have to work together a lot more. The social justice movements, the tax justice movements, the trade justice movements, the climate justice movements, in really unpacking and with the solutions that we have. Now, there's a lot of solutions. I mean, I don't, it's not that we don't have the solutions. It's always been a fight. And one of the fights has been like the agroecology movement. We know how to produce food without depending on pesticides and chemicals in the fossil fuel economy. We know how to protect the forests with our indigenous peoples and local communities, the Native Americans and the indigenous peoples of the US. They know how to live in harmony with the environment. They have principles that we need to aspire to. We have been talking about this issue about, and Gandhi had once said, there is enough resources to feed the world, but not enough for the greed of the world. Live simply so that others can simply live. So it actually really means that you relook and there is opportunity. And actually the COVID pandemic, the other side of the COVID pandemic actually showed that when the economy comes to a halt, people can still live. And people began to bake, people began to cook, people, mothers and fathers and children began to talk, because otherwise they were all holding their mobile phones and nobody was talking to each other. We began to see animals come into urban areas. I mean, so there was the other side. While people were dying mass loads and we didn't have, the global pharmaceutical big pharma, profited and refused to give vaccines much cheaper, free, and because of intellectual property rights. So the point being here is that there is another world, and we know how to live it. Now the real thing that we need to do is to get the corporations off our backs, need to reclaim the power, and we need to change the institutions and the rules of the game that are rigged against us. So yeah, there we are.
Yeah. Excellent. One last question, just to kind of bring us all the way around to kind of where we started. And we started with the Rio conference of 1992, which has fed into this, these yearly gatherings, the Conference of Parties. And we've just finished up the meeting in Belém. There was a lot of disappointment that there wasn't greater detail on, or any agreement, frankly, on rolling back fossil fuels. A little bit maybe progress on methane, but still, and on mobilizing funds for climate reparations or paying the climate debt. Still, a lot of progress needs to be made on that. But we're looking at another meeting, of course, every year. The next one will be in Turkey. with a lot of participation from Australia and Pacific Islands. As we, are coming out of Brazil and looking towards Turkey, what are the prospects? What demands realistically can be made? What kind of mobilization can be done between now and Turkey to make the next meeting, perhaps? And we're always waiting for that, that next COP that will be finally the place where world leaders come together and make a difference. What can we do between now and then to get closer to that reality?
Maybe I would just disagree with you, John, that the narrative, the mainstream narrative that the COP was seen as a failure, because I think that that was really the dominant narrative, which from our perspective was actually not correct. Because again, once again, the issue about the phasing out of fossil fuels was seen as the ambitious global north, together with the islands, of course, fighting the Gulf Corporation, the Gulf countries, and the other global South, including India and China. And they were the ones who didn't want to talk about fossil fuels in the agreement. I think what needs to be underscored is that when the issue about the roadmap on fossil fuels, that only came in the last minute of the negotiations. And so, but nobody understood what the roadmap was. Nobody looked at what the amount of money would be if you really translate the financing required to transform your economy. And this is where one of the biggest highlights and successes, which was underplayed, was the issue about the just transition. There was a very important outcome on just transition. And for us in civil society and movements, this is where one of the big areas of mobilizing that needs to happen. And if you look at what came out of the just transition discussion, many of us recognize the fact that yes, you need to phase out of fossil fuels, but what does that mean in terms of workers? In terms of not just workers, even in the agriculture sector, what does it mean for adaptation? How do you build resilience of communities? Where's the money for this? Where's the roadmap for the money? So a lot of it's you can't look at just a language which talks about fossil fuels without this entire gamut of what would make the conditions for the kind of just transition. What we were worried about, that actually the push was going to be an unjust transition. Because there was no appetite, as I said, we're talking about the climate debt, no appetite for relooking at provision of finance. There was a big push by a large number of countries called the like-minded developing countries, which was led by India and China, and even the Saudis are in that coalition, for looking at the provision of finance under the Article 9.1. They said, look, we need a discussion. We need a political space to discuss this. Now we have that. That came out of the Belém talks. A small progress. The developed world did not want to talk about it. They said, look, we don't need to talk about it. We will look at it in the context of the mobilizing. They said, no, we need a space. So there's a 2-year work program, small but important, to talk about the provision of finance in addition to the mobilization, but the provision. So it puts the political spotlight for us who are working in the climate justice movement to actually say, coming back to the payment of the climate debt and making those arguments. Then the just transition, the program was supposed to actually develop into what kind of arrangements can be made. Can we continue with the program? The Global North wanted to kill it. They said, no, we don't want to talk about just transition. Is your national problem. It's nothing to do with international cooperation. And the developing world said, no. And together with global civil society, we said, no, just transition is important. There is a mechanism there that is supposed to be developed. So a lot of opportunity. And if you look at the messages that came out there, the need to be inclusive, the need for indigenous peoples, prior informed consent, local communities, right to environment, right to clean air. I mean, it was labor rights, human rights. It's an embodiment of all that we have fought for. And that only came about because of our fight and the unity with the Global South. So, I mean, people say, the crop was a failure. I don't think it was a failure. I think these are building blocks. we are people who continue to build on the building blocks. We made some advances. We need to make more advances. And of course, right now, post Belém, we are all discussing how we can reconnect and re-energize and prepare for the kind of real just transition that needs to happen in the real world.
Mm. Well, since I direct a program called Global Just Transition, obviously this is good news to hear. And just kind of one last point on this. Some people say, look, China is already involved in doing this. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative, while it still is building out some dirty energy projects, still a lot of fossil fuel projects being developed through Belt and Road. Nevertheless, it's shifting. So more and more green related investments. So investments in some form of transition. Now, whether it's just or not, we can discuss, since often it doesn't really, it doesn't involve free and prior consent. It doesn't involve folks in those communities involved in the conversations around priorities. There are sometimes not very good labor conditions and sometimes not very good environmental conditions, but still, there's no question that China is interested and involved in this on the ground, regardless of what conversations take place globally. And so, is that something that we can work with? I mean, we just finished a project kind of looking at specifically Chinese investments in extraction around the world and community responses and development of grievance mechanisms that would provide for greater participation by communities and groups. But in your reading of the situation, is this something that can be developed in collaboration with China and other countries, so that we can talk about a just transition and push it forward even outside of the UN process?
For sure. I mean, this is something that the Third World Network is engaged with. Um, we also have been looking at the kind of learning from China, especially. It's amazing. It is not just on the mitigation side of things, but of course, we are critical if they are exporting. I mean, coal projects and so on. This is not what's needed, but I do think there's first we have to acknowledge the fact that is this about solidarity and cooperation or combat? And I think this is where the Western narrative is a problem, and particularly the US, the blame China game.
Mhm.
You blame China for everything. It's all China's fault,
Yeah.
which is what we cannot fall into. It's not China's fault. And so and the transition is difficult. How do you transform from a fossil based economy to one which is non-fossil based? I mean, I learned a lot and I've been learning a lot and I still don't know enough. For instance, if you rely, like in my own country, we are fighting for scaling up renewable energy. How do you change the grid? The grid, which is based on fossil fuel energy. Now you have to depend on weather-based system. And how does a weather-based system and does the grid network work? Can you have battery storage? How do you work with intermittency problems when
Mhm.
there is no sun? So these are real challenges. So I do think there's a tremendous opportunity, not only for government to government collaboration of the global south. This is what we've also been working with China on how do you actually unpack and really deal with the kind of real technology problems that you need to resolve, the kind of solutions which are there, to the kind of adaptation, and climate resilience kind of models. And there's a lot that we have to learn. And many are not even prepared. Maybe that's one thing that I need to say, that there's a lot to say, but in the just transition, the fact that with the US exit from the Paris Agreement and the drill baby drill, and I also say that the corollary of that or the consequence of that is drown baby drown, sad as it is. And many of our economies are not even ready for that. For instance, 2 years ago, when there was a heat wave in India, and I was talking to my colleagues in New Delhi, and I said, why don't you wake up early and have a shower, have a bath? instead of waiting and then maybe for cooling. They said, Meena, you actually don't even understand what's going on. The taps are so hot you can't even turn the water on. The air conditioning, which was the air conditioners which have been built, cannot cope with the new normal because the air conditioners are bursting.
Mm.
People who live in high-rise apartments, and the poor in particular, who have no options, who can't bring in more air conditioners, they don't have air conditioners, they don't even have fans, who are dying with heat. So you're talking about a new normal. Farmers who are used to a particular pattern in terms of agriculture, even in the agroecology movement, seeing weather patterns change. And so you're dealing with the new impacts, and many of us are not even ready for that. And this is a conversation that we are pushing ourselves, understanding how in a new climate impact world can we, with the kind of solutions that we have been advocating for, is this enough or is it not enough? And what is the learnings that we need to do? So this is where I think a lot of new thinking, new working with the movements on the ground needs to happen. So our work is cut out for us. We just need more people, much more people on board, and much more collaboration and cooperation, including with the governments of China and others.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a great place to end. And before we started, you said, do we need to talk for an hour? Do we have something to say for an hour? And I think we have enough for another hour, but
Yeah, yeah.
we'll have to call it quits here. I want to thank you so much, Meena, for this conversation. It really is a wonderful, not only an introduction to this question of climate reparations, but really an elaboration and a really deep dive into this subject. And I'm grateful for your spending the time with us today.
Thank you, John, for having me.